Uh, Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. We're just going to give everyone a couple more minutes to join, so please bear with us, and then we will get started shortly. Okay, well, like I said, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone on the webinar. Coming to you, well, I am anyway, from a stereotypically grey and wet United Kingdom. My name is Tom Hollobone, and I'm an Associate Managing Director in the Compliance, Risk and Diligence Unit at Kroll, a division of Duff and Phelps. I'm delighted to welcome you to the second in a series of webinars that will offer guidance to understand how to navigate and manage the potential risks that come with producing and procuring medical devices. This webinar examines the impact of COVID-19 has had on supply chains and explores some of the challenges that medical device manufacturers and supply chains could be facing. I'd like to welcome our two other panelists who are joining us today. We have Dan Harris and Daniel Hartnett. So Dan Harris is a founder of Harris Bricken, an international law firm with lawyers in Los Angeles, Portland, San Francisco, Seattle, China, and Spain. He primarily represents companies doing business in emerging market countries, having spent years building and maintaining a global professional network. His work has been as varied as securing the release of 2 improperly held helicopters in Papua New Guinea, overseeing hundreds of litigation and arbitration matters in Korea, and seizing fish product in China to collect on a debt. Dan regularly speaks at on China law issues, is the lead writer and the award-winning China law blog, and is regularly interviewed by mainstream media publications. Daniel Hartnett is a fellow associate managing director within the compliance, risk and diligence practice of Kroll, and is based in our Reston office. Daniel specializes in advising corporate clients on third-party risk management as it relates to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and the UK Bribery Act and similar local laws worldwide. Previously, Daniel served in various positions in and out of the US government, where he has advised on Asia-focused defense and security issues. Most recently, before joining Kroll, he concluded a 2-year assignment at the Pentagon as a special advisor, where he provided analytical and research support. Prior to this, he worked as a research scientist for CNA when he directed large, complex research projects on China's military and security developments on behalf of the US Department of Defense and the intelligence community. I also have the slightly strange task of introducing myself. So in addition to overseeing the EMEA research team, like Daniel, I specialize on advising and implementing vendor screening programs and assisting large multinational companies in setting up and maintaining robust anti-bribery procedures. I also work with clients to provide pre-transactional due diligence, competitive intelligence, ultimate beneficial owner research, and social media screening as well. So before we start on the topic of Q&A, please feel free to submit questions to Dan, Daniel, or myself using the question functionality on the right-hand side of the pane. and we will spend some time at the end of the webinar answering as many questions as we can. Any questions submitted that we can't address on the webinar, we will come back to people directly afterwards. We also have a very quick 2-question survey which will pop up at the end of the webinar. Please do stay to the end and give us your feedback to help us improve for next time. So the purpose of this webinar, as I stated, is to help understand how to navigate the potential risks that come with producing medical devices. Prior to COVID-19, companies were already having to adjust to a new or evolving geopolitical and cyber risks impacting their supply chain. Whilst these risks were substantial, COVID-19 is forcing many companies and even entire industries to rethink and transform their global supply chain model. With COVID-19 affecting most companies, some are being forced to abruptly shift to new business models in ways that significantly alter their risk and resilience. The industry is witnessing several unique strategies to address risks in supply chain. For example, the targeting of economic nationalism in some countries or risk concentration. And while COVID-19 may be the catalyst for companies to revisit their global supply chain strategy and accelerate the adoption of new models and capabilities, there are a number of actions which should be considered in order to respond to the immediate challenges. I'm going to pass over to Dan Hartnett now to give us his thoughts on the changes to supply chains now being experienced by the medical device industry. Dan.
Tom, thank you, and welcome to everyone. I just want to reiterate my thanks to Dan Harris for joining us today. And I also want to say thank you to all of the participants for being here. Hopefully this will be an interesting and engaging conversation. And we'll really be looking forward to your feedback and commentary and questions as well at the end. So without further ado, I'll jump into my portion of today's presentation. I'm going to really kind of be the scene setter today so that you can kind of have a big picture overview of what we're seeing in the supply chains, and particularly in the medical device supply chains, and to kind of set it up then for Dan Harris and Tom Hollobone, their parts of the presentation. So to make sure the slide goes to here. Okay, so let's talk about at a macro level, what's going on in global supply chains, right? This is, across various types of industries and geographies. So the bottom line really, and I'm sure you're all intimately aware of this, is that supply chains across the world are being severely impacted and disrupted by COVID-19. This builds upon, I would argue, what has been some disruptions in the supply chain world for 6 months or a year preceding that U.S.-China trade war, for example, figuring into that largely, as well as other activities. But it's really been COVID-19 has been the catalyst here. And so the supply chain networks after COVID-19 crisis, whenever that really is, right, in the true recovery and rebuilding phase, are going to be radically different than what they looked like just 6-7 months ago before going into this crisis. And there's a number of reasons we would argue for that, and that we're seeing from and hearing from our clients. First and foremost is that a lot of those third parties, right, the suppliers, the vendors, the logistics operators that you're dealing with, previously may no longer be around, right, because they've had to file bankruptcy or they've had to shut their doors, for example, right? This is particularly a large problem in small and medium-sized enterprises, right? Those that don't have the cash reserves to weather this storm, all right, especially as the dollars, week after week, month after month. It's also a major problem for any company, be it large or small, that is or was in financial distress prior to going into this crisis, right? This becomes a nail in the coffin, if you will, for those type of firms. Other changes occurring down there are those companies that do survive, that emerging on the other end looking different in how they entered into it, right? So those partners of yours that maybe had to do significant downsizing in order to survive, layoffs, restructuring, selling off components of their businesses, for example, so they no longer have the capacity to do what they could before. Or they're part of another firm, right? They merged with yet another firm, and the original legal entity that you've done business with no longer exists as it was previously. We've seen, because of the acquisition, right? A lot of acquisitions out there. Every crisis is an opportunity for someone else. And there are companies out there, there are individuals out there, PE firms, who are looking to maybe make a deal, right? To acquire other companies or capabilities on the cheap, if you will. And so your existing third parties may have new owners, right? They may not be the same entity or structure as before, right? We have from there, you're going to see continued second wave disruptions throughout the instance. We're seeing this already in America, particularly in the southern states, right? South Carolina, Texas, we're hearing of spikes of coronavirus again. This will continue to disrupt the supply chains across the globe. It'll be hard to predict where this is going to occur, right? What's happening today is not necessarily where it's going to be where it is tomorrow, for example. This will be particularly pick up, at least they anticipate picking up in the late fall, winter time frame. When normal flu season occurs in the northern hemisphere. We're also going to see issues of, and we already are hearing about this, of companies saying, maybe we went too far in co-locating all of our suppliers in one geographic location. Case in point, China, right? Where not only do you have your first tier suppliers, but you may have your second, third, fourth, and so on suppliers, where if that jurisdiction, for whatever reason, it goes into some kind of disrupted mode or shut down, or there's some kind of trade, closures of the borders, then it picks all of them, right? And so it really brings your supply chain and your capabilities to a halt almost overnight, if you will. And then finally, it ties into a little bit to the US-China trade war, but more broadly, this notion of, well, maybe we shouldn't be outsourcing and offshoring every single capability within our supply chain. I don't necessarily believe that, we're all going to just suddenly reshore and the age of globalization is over, but I do think that companies are looking at components of their supply chain, certain critical parts maybe, or providers, and thinking, well, maybe it'd be better to have them on our shore, or maybe it'd be better and safer to have them near shoring, right? For the US, it might be Mexico or Canada, for example. And so a lot of our clients are looking at, onboarding, new suppliers in those jurisdictions. All right, so moving to the next slide. Let's drill down a little bit more into the medical device supply chain, all right? So layered on top of all those more general type disruptions that we're seeing in global supply chains, you have some that are relatively unique to the medical device industry. And here I lay out a few of them that we've been seeing and hearing about in recent months. First and foremost, I would argue is a quality issue. Now, I know there are a lot of attendees today from the healthcare industry, for example, and so quality issues front and center, right? Making sure that the personal protective equipment you're supplying to your first line providers, the nurses, the doctors, the healthcare providers, is up to snuff. Is doing what it should be doing, right? And there's always that concern in the background, and we're seeing a lot of instances where N95 masks, for example, aren't really N95 masks, right? And so that's happening around the globe. Related to that is a spike in fraud and corruption, right? Where people are taking advantage of the desperation that is out there. I think back to my comment about how we're trying to provide these goods to our frontline providers, who are working there day in and day out at the hospitals, for example. Unfortunately, people are very clearly trying to take advantage of this. We're seeing account after account around the globe where suppliers are supplying what they rightly know is not up to snuff, where agents are sourcing products or have no products to source but are just pretending they're sourcing, right? We're hearing anecdotal evidence of even sellers where themselves who have come over here into the States, for example, or into Europe, and providing goods that they know are not where they should be, right? So all the different forms of fraud and corruption, and I'll talk more about that in the next slide. What I refer to as hyper demand volatility, or really just hyper demand, right? This is the idea that there is too much demand, overwhelming the supply capabilities right now. And I'm sure many of you are experiencing this or have experienced this in the past. So you see the quote there on the right from Governor Cuomo, it's about, I think that was about a month and a half ago. We were talking about how, it's not only, supplier versus, actually that's not, sorry, not supplier versus supplier, but it's buyer versus buyer, but it's state versus state. It's state versus national governments. It's national governments versus national governments. It's a very what I would call bare knuckle fight out there in many ways to acquire the devices that you need to protect your staff and employees, to the point that you're seeing consolidation of some of these buyers to try and pool or leverage their capabilities, something I'll also talk about in a little bit. Confusing regulatory environment. I won't talk too much about this, but this is the idea of testing and trials for any new devices coming onto the markets, where they're changing sometimes almost daily. You don't really know what the latest regulations are, and you compound it by a lot of the manufacturers who are getting in this space. Well-intentioned manufacturers may not be aware of the regulations, and so they're kind of behind. So there's a little bit of confusion going on there. Hopefully that will taper off going into the future, but it is an issue we've encountered in the past. We've had trade restrictions. What can you import or export? And these vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, as a map in the bottom right-hand corner shows you. A lot of times it may be, you can import some things from China, let's say, but you can't import other things, or maybe the rules change in mid-process. And so you have to constantly, keep aware of them, which is hard in and of itself, but then also then react. What do you do when all of a sudden your incoming shipment no longer is available and you have to then pivot to someone else, again, with a small supply out there. And then finally, the overall idea of just the U.S.-China geopolitical competition. As Tom had mentioned, I've been, kind of a recovering China watcher, if you will, for almost 2 decades. And I would argue that the relationship is in a very negative state right now, and it's impacting a lot of things, but very clearly here in the medical device supply chain. And it's quite ugly, I would argue, where it's a tit for tat spat going back and forth, he says, she said type thing. And it has bigger implications for the ability to procure sources, particularly when you think that China is a major provider of most PPE items. Okay, so let's talk about fraud and corruption, right? Now, this is one of the issues that we've definitely seen, especially from Tom and I's perch working compliance, risk, and diligence division of Kroll. There is a lot of fraud and corruption out there, right? You see the quote there on the right from a Hong Kong-based trader that was in a Washington Post article recently, where really it's just up and down the supply chain, where individuals and companies are trying to take advantage of people's desperation, is what it really starts with. I would argue that the WHO estimate there is probably a little low, but at the same time, world production of PPE needs to grow by 40%, right? And that's if we really don't factor in any kind of resurgence or secondary waves that are, occurring in the United States, for example, right now, right? The masks, the gloves, the gowns, let alone all the items people need just to kind of, send their kids to school or to go out and go shopping, for example, right? And a lot of organizations have fallen victim to this. We're seeing it constantly in the news and hearing about it anecdotally from clients where, it could be a hospital system, it could be government organizations, states here in the United States, or national governments over in Europe, and actual companies as well, trying to procure items for their employees so that they can, continue to do their jobs. Maybe they're essential employees, for example, right? And so the fraud is not just specific to agents, or it's not just specific to manufacturers, but it really runs up and down the gamut to sellers and resellers. And really the bottom line there, I would argue, is that, while painful and maybe a little bit more time consuming, it is critical to really know who your vendor is. This is, not the time to skimp on that type of work. Now, as a result of all this fraud, what we're also seeing is that governments around the globe are prioritizing going after this, right, and clamping down, as they should be, right? You can see the near veritable, alphabet soup of U.S. government agencies who have some kind of role, or have announced publicly at least that they have some kind of role to play in either investigating or screening, their remit within the medical device supply chain to make sure they tamp down on this and then prosecute those who are committing these crimes. Tom's going to speak a little bit about the European Anti-Fraud Office later on, but you see it over there, and I believe there's been several hundred investigations to date going on over there. So this is a problem the authorities have recognized and are doing their best to do, yet unfortunately it still does exist. So my final slide kind of just summarize it all, or bring it back together. What does this mean for the overall medical device industry and those who are procuring those goods? First and foremost is the obvious. It's just going to be constant upheaval up and down the supply chain, right? We're not out of this yet, not from a healthcare perspective, nor from a supply chain perspective. So that the problems here, and they need to be agile and focused on finding new sources and vetting them, will continue going forward. There's always going to be the concern of counterfeit parts, right? You have a quote there where individuals are still putting money down and trying to procure these items, knowing full well that they may actually not be receiving what they are hoping to receive, but yet they feel like their back's up against the wall and they have no choice but to take that risk. That's a very bad situation, obviously, as you can imagine, but it's what's occurring out there. The changes for regulatory environments, be they from the testing or trials, which I do hope are kind of tampering down, But then you have the regulatory environment of what can you or can you not export. That could change on a dime. If one of these jurisdictions that produces something all of a sudden has an uptick in localized cases, they may change their export laws again, right? And so that would then again intrude a bit of disruption into the free flowing of the supply chain. All this will then boil down to the continual need to rapidly pivot to find alternate sources and suppliers and agents. I mean, look, I study supply chains. I understand it. It's difficult. You really don't want uncertainty in the supply chain. It causes a lot more heartache and issues. Unfortunately, this is an issue that we have to be good at. There's no way around it for right now, at least. There's been a lot of talk about other companies out there who, are pivoting at the last minute to provide PPE, because they're volunteering their manufacturing capabilities, and this is awesome. But that also does create a little bit of risk, right? What does that mean from the idea that these are new, unknown, and untested suppliers? Now, some of them may be named household names, and so therefore you feel a little more comfortable with them. Others, you may never have heard of them. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're wrong, that they're doing anything bad, but you might want to do a little more due diligence there, right? We just have to be clear. Otherwise, you might get that, counterfeit parts or even unintentionally poor quality parts, right? And then finally, I mentioned before the rise of these consortiums to pool purchasing power. In Europe, a lot of the countries themselves are procuring the items, right, for a centralized hospital system. So it's a little bit different in the United States. However, I mentioned before you have, hospitals versus hospitals, states versus states, and even states versus governments, right, national governments. And so what you see then is a couple of states pulling together to try and increase their leverage over procurement. And so one of the largest ones I'd heard of was the 7-state consortium that was set up in the northeast of the United States. New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, I believe New Jersey was also part of that, Rhode Island. So they can then compete with larger entities also out there trying to buy those same goods, be it California in the United States or in other nation states. What this means, though, is unfortunately that these smaller entities are going to get squeezed out, right? If you have 7 pretty large, wealthy states in the United States banding together, what does that mean for a hospital system that's left on its own in some other state that may not have the resources behind it? It's going to be a problem. It is a problem right now. So I hate to end on a negative note. The only uplifting thing I can say is that there are steps that people can take to try and minimize their exposure to some of these risks. Dan and Tom will talk a lot more about those. And that's it. That I conclude. I look forward to any questions you might have in the Q&A period, and I hope this has been insightful to you all. Dan, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Daniel said he did not want to end on a negative note. I should probably give you a trigger warning by saying that almost everything I'm going to talk about is going to be pretty negative. Starting with the fact that, oh, there we go. Okay. Having a little trouble. Okay, with my screen here. Okay, so I'm going to be talking mostly from the things that I have seen and that my law firm's PPE team has seen with respect to what's going on out there and what we've seen with our own clients. So Daniel touched on this a bit in terms of talking about fraud. What we've seen are companies looking for suppliers, and how do you find your suppliers? And we've asked our clients this, and a lot of them are getting them from databases, from Alibaba, and friend-of-friend referrals. And that is not traditionally how our clients find their suppliers, meaning a typical client of ours in the pre-COVID days might fly to China and meet with 10 different companies before choosing one. So right off the bat, the way suppliers are being found for PPE these days increases risk. But obviously, our clients don't really have that much choice because of the urgency. Who are we seeing out there buying PPE from China and from other countries. Hospitals, governments, charities, entrepreneurs. And all of these entities were in the PPE business early. And the bottom two have, at least near as we can tell, to a large extent dropped out. And the reason they've dropped out is because getting the product, getting good product, dealing with all the issues is so difficult. And it's particularly difficult, it's difficult for entrepreneurs, and what that translates as is no profits and huge risks. Daniel was talking about doing due diligence on companies. We had a client that was using one of the best sourcing agents we know in China. They were working with one of the largest, best companies in China, and everything was looking good. And we said, can you send us the documents? And in the documents was a completely fake US FDA certificate. It was a terrible fake. I said to one of our lawyers, it looks like a Microsoft template. And they said, no, it's not even that good. It looks like it came off some Chinese software program. And so we went back to the sourcing agent who I've known for probably 10 or 15 years. I said, are you sure you're dealing with this big company? Because why would they use a fake FDA certificate when they actually have US FDA certification? And he said, yes, I'm certain that I am. Well, it turned out he was dealing with a rogue employee in that big company. So fortunately, our client never sent over any money, and they ended up getting out of the business. Okay, these are some of the observations I've had about China over the years. I use these in a lot of the presentations I do, but I've honed them down to those that are particularly relevant for PPE, buying PPE from China. Number one, China's government does not like you. They really don't. They don't like Americans. They don't like Brits. They like some Europeans more than Americans and Brits, but they tend not to like foreigners. That is important to remember, because if China does something randomly, that should not come as a surprise for you. If China does something that you think hurts China economically, that should not come as a surprise to you. You should be prepared for that. Okay, your Chinese employees are not China law experts. We see this, we've been seeing this a lot with PPE, where somebody will say, well, let's say a hospital client will have somebody in the US who's Chinese, and we will say, look, this particular PPE cannot be exported from China right now. The law is clear on that. And they'll say, well, so-and-so says that it can. And when we say, well, look, it can't. You can, if you want to take the risk of trying to get something out of China that violates Chinese law, we can't stop you, but the law is clear on this. So you have to be careful about that also. And yet what's written in Chinese law may not be what happens in real life. That's always been true. Generally, when it comes to PPE, what this means is that if the law is good, real life will be worse. If the law is bad, real life will be worse. So you cannot rely just on the law. You need to know exactly what is going on every minute in China. This is true with respect to its export controls. This is true with respect to logistics. It's true regarding everything. Okay, my screen. There we go. And yet the laws apply to foreigners, always. They apply harder to foreigners than to Chinese domestic companies. So if your Chinese domestic company says, last week we were able to get this product out, that doesn't mean they'll be able to get it out this week if the laws have changed, or even if you're buying from if it's going to be shipped from a different port or shipped to a different country than the last shipment. And of course, as Daniel mentioned, the laws are constantly changing. They're changing in China, they're changing in the United States, and I presume they're changing in other countries as well. In China, they change in terms of exports. In the United States, they change in terms of imports and what you can legally sell. So some of the key questions that you need to always be considering, the first one is, the key question is, what will you be on the hook for? And probably once or twice a day, I get an email from a company that has bought PPE from China and now has a major problem. And I would say about at least 80% of the time, a very quick look at their documents tells us that their problem was a problem they created and there's nothing we can do about it. A lot of times they don't understand the import-export terms, and they didn't realize they signed a contract that said no matter what happens, they will be on the hook. So if the Chinese company's product is held up at customs in China, our client, or usually they're not our client, they are on the hook. Quality issues. Most of the deals that we've seen, the quality protections are terrible. And that's even true of the deals that we've been involved in, because a lot of companies are just unwilling right now to make any sorts of promises regarding quality. They're also unwilling to make any sorts of promises regarding delivery dates. They'll tell you they'll get it to you in such and such amount of time, but when you try and put that in a contract that can be enforced, oftentimes they won't sign it. And why should they? They have almost an unlimited line of buyers, and so if you're going to be a tough buyer, they'll just move on to another one. Daniel talked about the confusing regulatory environment. The slides I'm going to show you next, I'm not going to read them. You don't have to read them. They're there really to just show how difficult and confusing they are. Okay, so when we started doing this work in late February, there was order number 5. It dealt with these issues. One of the things it never explained was what constitutes medical use. Then came on April 10th, came announcement number 53, where China Customs said that they would start checking medical supplies for quality. One of our lawyers who has been doing China work for probably 20, 25 years said, that's always bad. When China Customs says they're going to be checking exports for quality, that usually means one of two things. One, the products will never leave, or two, the price will go way up because China Customs is going to get their quote unquote share out of the products. And since announcement number 53, we've been seeing both of those things happen. Again, they talk about medical use, they never define it. Then on April 25th, a couple of Chinese state agencies announced additional quality control requirements for additional PPE. And again, this comes out and we lawyers look at it and we say, well, this is what it says, but until we see how it's put into action, it's very hard to give advice to our clients on it. All we can tell them is, look, the fact that they came out with something means they're trying to do something, they're trying to get tougher. And Daniel talked about how you could argue that relations between China and the US or China and the West are very negative, I would say you don't need to argue. That's a fact. And relations between China and many countries around the world have gotten very bad. And I view most of these announcements and orders as reflecting that. China claims they're doing these things to improve quality. I do not believe that for a minute. I think the Chinese government is doing this so that they can control who gets what and who profits from what. And again, no one really knows what medical use is. Okay, so how do you get your product through China customs? I list out the following. These things can help. They are definitely not guarantees. Number one, you need to make sure that your Chinese seller is legitimate, that they're licensed to make and export the product that you are buying. Make sure that your paperwork and their paperwork is perfect. Make sure that your PPE product is of good quality and not counterfeit. There have been a lot of counterfeit products coming out of China, counterfeits of other Chinese companies. The big Chinese companies that are known for making good masks have had their products ripped off left and right since the COVID problem spread to the West. Make sure that your PPE can be legally sent to and received at its intended destination. And a lot of these things hold true for any country you're buying from. One of the things we have seen lately is companies, hospitals, governments looking at other countries to get their PPE for various different reasons. One, they're sick of China. Two, they need more PPE of good quality. And a lot of countries have restrictions on exports. And a lot of countries will allow the export of one type of PPE, but not another. Some will allow it to some countries. Some will allow it for some uses. You need to look at that. Now, in our role as a lawyer, we've been very hamstrung by PPE. In the old days, if someone were buying a product from China, we would tell them, okay, we can help draft the contract. It'll take us 10 to 15 days. We draft a contract, we send it to the Chinese company. It has warranty provisions, late delivery provisions, damages provisions, etc. That's not the case here. Nobody has time for that. No Chinese company is going to sign these. And that's been generally true of the other countries that are selling as well. So what is left in the contract? Very, very little. I mean, we're turning these around oftentimes in 5-6 hours. There's not much that go in them. So why bother at all? Well, these are the three reasons I always give for having a contract with an emerging market country or with a company in an emerging market country without a good legal system. Do it for clarity. Put it in their language so at least it's clear you're on the same page. Do it for prevention. Do it so that at least there's some belief on their part that if they cheat you or provide bad product, that you might have a chance of recourse. And that's where the enforcement comes in. What we want to see at minimum is that if our client doesn't get the product, they at least the contract says they get their money back. Now, some of you are probably thinking, well, why do they pay in advance? In the old days, we would have that advance payment be as little as possible. These days, a lot of times that just is not possible. Okay, so in these rush situations, we have our clients draft up a one-page term sheet, oftentimes not even in the language of the foreign company, just to make sure that they're roughly on the same page before we draft the contracts. So the term, and then the contract, we first put it in English, give it to our clients, then we put it in the foreign language. And generally, if there's time, we do that with the term sheet as well. So what is a good contract with China? When I used to give this talk, there were probably 8 things on here. Forget about it. You can't deal with all those. It should be a real contract. It should be in writing. China doesn't do well with emails if you have to go to court. It should provide for damages. It should be in one language. It can be in 2 languages, but by one language, there should be one official language. And you should think about where your dispute is going to be resolved. And generally, believe it or not, in this situation, it should usually be resolved in the foreign country. So it should usually be resolved in front of a Chinese court, not, let's say, an American court or British court. Yes, American courts are better. Yes, your chances of winning in the United States are better. But if you win in the United States, you can't take that judgment to China and do anything with it. So you're left with the U.S. judgment. And if that Chinese company doesn't have assets in the United States, that judgment's going to be worthless. And if you can, you want to still get that document sealed. Chinese courts are not obligated to enforce most foreign country court judgments, and they don't. And they also tend not to enforce foreign court judgments of countries that they are supposed to enforce. So I mentioned that there's been a movement that started probably about a month and a half ago and has really accelerated to get PPE from other countries. And these are the countries that we are seeing: Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, Korea, Taiwan, and Asia. It says no FM. The Thailand, Malaysia, and Korea do not allow, as of right now, the exporting of face masks. Vietnam says they don't allow that. They have a lot of exceptions. So far, our clients have had very good success getting face masks from Vietnam. But those clients have all been hospital clients. Indonesia is going to open up for exports on June 30th. We'll see what happens there. The EU is open for exports generally, but some countries are not. We've had clients buying product from Germany, Spain, and Poland. We've had clients buying product from Turkey. They don't allow exporting face masks. We've had clients buying product from Mexico. We have a big hospital chain that pays more for their product from Mexico. They're happy to do that because they feel that it's almost patriotic, and they've been getting good product, and they like the diversification. And we are starting to see hospital chains buy things like gowns from American producers, and we have clients who are talking about setting up PPE manufacturing in the United States and in Canada. Be careful out there. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dan. So just a reminder to anyone, if you have any questions for Daniel or Dan, please do submit them via the functionality on the right-hand side of your screen now. Great. So as Dan and Daniel have highlighted, there are a lot of third parties that are essentially adjusting their models and production lines at the moment. So what are some of those questions that you need to ask yourselves when assessing these companies? For companies that are now making medical devices when they weren't before, what should we be asking around them in particular? Well, firstly, we want to understand what they did before and how well did they execute that. Were they, for example, a market leader in producing similar products using similar materials, like Rolls-Royce and Dyson, for example, who are have been producing ventilators for the UK government. Companies like this will have complex production line experience. They will have also demonstrated that they can produce items to a required and regulated standard. Or are they in a completely different industry and activity? Do they have little to no experience of regulation and large-scale production? In addition, you should also consider what the reputation is of that company. Are they renowned? Are they respected in their industry? Or are they known to produce substandard work or have had compliance or ethical issues in the past, such as bribery or even modern slavery issues. These are all questions that we should be being asked at that point when you're engaging companies like this or kind of prior to engagement. You need to become comfortable understanding their background before making decisions to engage them. But for established companies that are already in the medical devices sector, the questions to ask and the points to consider are slightly different. We should still be looking at their reputation, but we should be delving a little bit deeper into that and looking in particular at their reputation in the sector specifically. Are they known to be a reliable partner, or is there evidence of them having issues such as regulatory censure, unethical or illegal practices, or a history of poor performance against deadlines? Have there been significant changes to the business as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic? As Daniel said earlier, have they had to downscale their production line? Have they diversified their production locations or had to consolidate, meaning that their volumes have been affected? And any significant changes to a company's standing or their operational status should trigger further risk assessments if you're already working with them, both from an operational risk perspective, but also from a reputational risk perspective as well. So this is all well and good, but we're regularly asked by our clients about the practicalities of how to react in these situations and where to start. And there are certainly some red flags that we can look out for and actions that we can take to help make a decision about the risks presented in a potential transaction. So firstly, as Dan mentioned in his presentation, how were they sourced or how were they introduced to you and to the business? Did they approach your company completely out of the blue offering their services? Or were they referred by someone who is known and trusted to the business? Has that contact had dealings with them directly? And if so, how successful were those dealings that they had with them? Trying to get a sense of the track record of this individual or this referrer before you get too far down the line with them. How are they communicating with you? Are they using an email address linked to a domain or a website which will provide you information about the company or the person? Or are they communicating through unusual channels like WhatsApp or a personal email address like a Hotmail or a Gmail address? Are they hard to get hold of? Obviously outside of any time zone considerations. But these are all indications that someone maybe is being opportunistic. Dan mentioned that the entrepreneurs maybe are starting to move away from this, these situations as we see them now, which can only be a good thing for those companies, or hospitals, governments, whoever is genuinely in need of this equipment. But it's a good indication of someone who's maybe being opportunistic, but without the experience to back it up. And we also mentioned before the track record. It's a very good indicator. Do they have a track record in the medical devices sector? Or do they have a demonstrable track record in their industry? Can you get comfortable that they will be able to deliver on the commitments that they're making to you? Can they explain the origin of the equipment? If they can't explain where this has come from or how so much of it is available at a time of unprecedented demand, then that should really be ringing alarm bells for the buyer. It may turn out these individuals or the referrers or the intermediaries, do they have access or rights over that stock? Has that stock even been produced yet? Are they selling something that isn't even there? And so it's important to ask those questions. And we've talked a lot about production up to the required standards. That is also a key question to ask and assurances to gain beforehand. And lastly, this is a red flag across many industries, but last-minute changes to payment instructions or changes to who the actual recipient of that money is going to be is something that really should make the hair stand up on the back of our necks. It's a very clear indicator of something that should be looked into further there, should be queried, and you should understand, all of the elements of and all of the individuals or companies that are involved in that payment. You should understand who they are before any payment is made. So a lot of these suggestions may seem obvious, but obviously they're worth actively considering. As a compliance professional, or as someone who takes risk-based decisions on a regular basis, our gut feel is usually our cumulative experience saying to us this doesn't add up, and we really need to understand that and react to that. It shouldn't be the reason we stop a transaction and see something, but it obviously should prompt us to look further into it to help us and our company avoid making any mistakes. Daniel, not sure if you can help me there.
Yeah, I'm not sure the slides keep freezing up. I apologize. Let me see if you want me to advance to the next one for you.
Yes, please. That'd be great.
All right, 1 second. Sorry. All right.
Brilliant. Thank you. We as an industry, and people in the medical devices industry are being cognizant of who we're dealing with, but how are the authorities helping us? So law enforcement authorities around the world have really mobilized to try and combat fraud and corruption in the medical devices sector, sorry. And in March this year, as Daniel mentioned, the European Anti-Fraud Office, known as OLAF, has opened a official inquiry into the illicit trade of medical devices, of equipment and test kits, and so far, as of June, they had identified over 340 companies that were acting as intermediaries or traders of counterfeit or substandard products that were linked to the COVID-19 pandemic. And as part of this, millions of substandard medical products with fake EU conformity certificates have been seized, and these CE certificates that a lot of you will see, and you can see one on the screen here. And as Dan mentioned, they're meant to guarantee that the products are compliant with the EU health and safety standards, but they've obviously seen a huge amount of fake certificates flying around. In the UK in particular, the National Cybersecurity Centre has been disrupting online shops selling fraudulent PPE equipment. And in the US, the Secret Service Assistant Director, Michael D'Ambrosio, recently testified that they had initiated over 100 criminal investigations and had prevented approximately $1 billion in fraud losses. They had also successfully disrupted hundreds of online COVID-19 related scams, such as fraudulent medical equipment, non-delivery scams, which is another one that we've been seeing, and even ransomware attacks that have been linked to COVID-19 as well. So law enforcement are trying to keep up with and react to what's going on in the market, but obviously they're a step ahead. So, essentially, does this mean that we don't have to be vigilant? And the answer, of course, is absolutely not. And unwittingly, in keeping with Daniel and Dan, I'm going to leave on a slightly negative note. And I'm going to leave everyone with some cold, hard statistics from a recent report that was published by the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, who were polled as part of a report into fraud in the wake of COVID-19. So we've got some really good recent data from anti-fraud and compliance professionals. And across these three risk areas that we can see that we've highlighted here, the belief within the compliance and audit and anti-fraud functions of numerous companies across not only the medical sector, but also across a number of sectors, but that the instances of risks, these risks in particular materializing, are expected to increase further. as Dan has mentioned, the medical devices supply chains are facing unprecedented fraud and corruption risks, and we can see from the results of the survey. 86% of the people that responded expected that fraud by vendors and sellers would increase further than it has already over the next 12 months. We see an equally high number of respondents expecting payment fraud to increase as well. And as companies will be onboarding new suppliers, they're diversifying their supply chains and their suppliers. It really demonstrates the need for companies to adhere to and enforce their own processes and procedures around payments to minimize the chance of payment fraud. So understanding who you're paying, ensuring that you're obtaining correct invoices, that you're checking the details that are on those invoices, you're verifying that you've received that stock, and really understanding where that's going is really important over the next 12 months. And likewise with bribery and corruption, 72% of those respondents expected it to rise in the next 12 months. Some slightly, some significantly, 31% significantly. And this expectation shows how important it is really to understand who you're dealing with and how those deals or those contracts are structured. And in particular with agents and intermediaries, where we see the risk of bribery and corruption is at its highest. So we really need to be asking ourselves questions: who am I dealing with? What is their background? Are they considered politically exposed? How do we understand who their connections are? How are they being remunerated? Is it in line with expectations? And are we paying market value? Are all really key questions that should be being asked for these significant contracts, and in particular obtaining PPE equipment through agents and intermediaries. So by remaining vigilant and asking questions of your new and existing suppliers, we can really help to identify the risks that either can be managed through the contracting process or by the way in which the third parties are managed and dealt with within your organization. So we hope you found today's webinar informative. I think we've got a little bit of time to move on to some questions. So John, do we have any questions from the audience that we want to pose to Dan or Daniel or myself?
Yes, thank you, Tom. So we did have a few questions come in. The first one's for Daniel Hartnett, and the question is, if you were to have a go at predicting the future, which would be the most significant long-term change in global supply chains?
$1 million question, or maybe in this case, the $1 billion question, right? I don't know if we can predict one major change, but I do think there are 2 or 3 we can highlight, right? And they almost kind of mutually reinforcing or an interactive effect between them. I think the first one is, as I mentioned, it's coming to this kind of rebuilding and restructuring of supply chains across the globe, right? Companies are already taking advantage of the situation to see whether they can optimize their supply chains, right? We have colleagues across our enterprise in Duff and Phelps who are assisting clients to understand, okay, if you have the opportunity to rebuild and resource for different location, how should you do it in a very smart and intelligent way, right? How can you do it to make sure that you can minimize your risk and optimize your flow through. So I think that's the number one issue, is it's restructuring, right? Tied to that is probably the rise of supply chain risk management. I mean, let's talk about the idea that SCRM, supply chain risk management, as the acronym is pronounced, is getting its day, in C-suite, discussions right now with the board right now to an extent that has never really been there before. So I think going forward, as companies think about how they're going to lay out their supply chains and where they're going to get their sources from, the risk component will play a factor there, as it should, arguably. I think the third one is, what all of us kind of talked about a little bit is, the notion of China, right? Where's China's role in this going forward? It's still hard to be determined, but my gut feeling is that it's going to be sort of this kind of almost like moving away slightly from China. I don't think it'll be a complete abandonment. I don't think it ever could be a complete abandonment of China. That's not going to happen. It's just too hard and it takes too much time and effort to do that. But I do think the changes will be, you're hearing more and more about China plus one, right? So you're having an alternate supplier there that is not located within China in order to kind of, again, minimize your risk of both geographic concentration that might be due to another pandemic or might be due to trade war issues, be it with the US and China or China and other entities. So those are the kind of three main things going on. To sum it up in a nutshell, but it still remains to be seen, to be ultimately honest with you.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. So we had a few more questions come in, but it looks like we're out of time, Tom. So we can respond to those individually after the session is over. So I'll hand it back to you, Tom.
Great, thank you, John. So a massive thank you to everyone for joining us today. As I mentioned at the start, this is the second in a series of webinars that we're hosting. The next session will be scheduled for the end of July. So please do join us then. For those of you that have joined us now, we'll make sure to share those details. We also, like I mentioned, we also have a very quick 2-question survey which will pop up at the end of the webinar. So please do give us your feedback. And then we hope you can join us again for the next session. So thank you all very much and goodbye.